First, we're always asked why take on a case concerning historical allegations of torture going back 50 years. And it's fair to say that the first reaction of Leigh Day when we were approached about the case was very hesitant. And the initial reaction of most people is that this happened so long ago, why reopen these wounds when there are so many other pressing human rights issues in Kenya. But for Leigh Day, this was quite close to our hearts because we had acted for the British prisoners of war who were ill-treated by the Japanese, and we settled the case for nominal amounts, but the recognition was really important to the victims. So how could we refuse to take on this case when the allegations have been just as bad and more recent? So, was the need for justice any less strong for rural Kenyans than it was for British veterans? Clearly it's just as important. And then the second question we're always asked were the Mau Mau brutal terrorists who committed appalling acts of abuse of their own. And we're not denying that acts of abuse were committed by the Mau Mau. Of course, abuses were committed on both sides, but there are 2 points here really. Firstly, large numbers of people who had little or no involvement with the Mau Mau were detained and tortured, including many of our claimants, and most were detained without charge or trial for years. And secondly, even if a detainee or a prisoner of war is guilty of brutality, does that justify appalling and systematic abuse by the government of the day, which is a British government who has consistently stood against the use of torture? Clearly, there can be no justification for the abuses which were perpetrated in Kenya at the time. So, how did Leigh Day become involved? Well, Dan mentioned the banning of the Mau Mau before 2003. So, in 2003, the Mau Mau were unbanned, so they were free to meet and talk about what had happened. And this has led to the creation of victim organisations in Kenya who are now calling for redress. There are about just over 1,000 survivors from the camps who are still alive, and they're all in their 70s and 80s, who principally just want recognition and an apology from the government. Leigh Day were first approached by John Nottingham, who's an inspirational figure. He was a district commissioner in Kenya at the time of the abuses, and he knew firsthand of the abuses, and he refused to become involved in the abuses where something called the dilation technique was being used. And he's been campaigning for many years for redress for the victims. Kenyan Human Rights Commission became involved, and they were critical in identifying the victims and bringing them to the UK. And the claims have had strong public support of the Kenyan government, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Attorney General. Now, the claimants came over in 2009 to issue their claim, and they delivered a letter personally to the Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, asking him to resolve the issue, which then led to a meeting with David Miliband, who was very sympathetic. Now, we put to the government an options for justice paper, and we asked for a statement of regret, an apology, and a carefully conceived welfare fund for the elderly victims, many of whom are, as you can imagine, still struggling from the psychiatric and the physical injuries that they sustained in the period. And we're not asking for millions of pounds of compensation. All the claimants want, what they're primarily concerned about is getting recognition for what happened and an apology. It's appalling that the government feel they still can't recognise what happened